Welcome to the Maison Française for this talk and discussion with Etienne Balibar. I'm Madeleine Doby. I'm the chair of the Columbia University Department of French. It's my great honor and pleasure this evening to introduce Etienne, who has been a visiting professor in the Department of French and the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society since 2012. But from whom we have been cruelly separated for the past 2 years as a result of the pandemic. As many of you here know, in addition to being one of the most important engaged intellectuals of the last half-century, Etienne Balibar is an unfailingly generous colleague. And so we have really missed him over the past 2 years, and it's wonderful to have him back with us for a couple of weeks. During his stay at Columbia, Etienne will be giving 3 talks, so this evening's talk, and then on September 26th, he will discuss a piece about the war in Ukraine titled All in the War, and that will be at the Columbia University Seminar in Literary Theory, and you can find information about that on the seminar website. And on September 28th, again here at the Maison Française, he will join Bernard Harcourt for the inaugural session of his new seminar in the 1313 series, Critical Theoretic Foundations for Concrete Utopias. And you can find more about that talk on the website of the Center for Contemporary Critical Thought. So I won't take up your time trying to review Etienne Balibar's intellectual biography or body of work, from his early landmark collaboration with Louis Althusser and the other leading young French Marxist philosophers of the day on Lire le Capital, to his explorations starting in the 1980s of questions of nationhood, citizenship, and race. Any such overview would take much too long because Etienne Balibar is prolific, and he is prolific because his thinking is in its essence unfinished, dynamic, in progress, in dialogue with the work of other thinkers, and evolving in response to conditions and events in the world. I first had the pleasure of meeting Etienne Balibar in 2005 when I invited him to Columbia to deliver one of the 2 keynote addresses at a conference that I co-organized with Antoine Compagnon, ici présent, devoted to the 100th anniversary of the separation of church and state in France. Remember that the other keynote was given by the late Svetlana Todorov. And Etienne was going to be introduced by his good friend, my colleague, Professor Emeritus Andreas Huyssen, the co-founder of the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society. And a couple of hours before Etienne's keynote, Andreas said to me, "You know, Etienne hasn't finished his talk. And he hasn't finished his talk because he keeps rewriting it in response to what Todorov has said and in response to what all the other speakers are saying." And so I retain a vivid memory of reams of paper with lots of erasures and inserted passages. And so I wasn't in the least surprised, Etienne, yesterday when you wrote saying you couldn't share your talk because you were rewriting it. So just to add a thought to that, as some of you know, Etienne Balibar is retiring from his visiting appointment at Columbia. But since it's really impossible to use the word retirement in the same sentence with the name Etienne Balibar, it's just so unthinkable that Etienne would ever retire from thinking, from writing, we are calling it his unretirement. This evening, Etienne Balibar will be speaking on the subject of cosmopolitics, a topic that encompasses much of his influential thinking over the last 3 decades or more on globalization, sovereignty and citizenship, the question of the border, the myth and the reality of Europe, and the forms and meanings of racism today. This body of work, explored in books including Race, Nation, Class, his landmark collaboration with Emmanuel Wallerstein, Droit de cité, Nous citoyens d'Europe, Europe, crise et faim, is revisited in the volume of Etienne's writings recently published by La Découverte, verte, I have it here, under the title Cosmopolitique, des frontières à l'espèce humaine. So as the title Des frontières à l'espèce humaine suggests, Etienne Balibar's exploration of cosmopolitics has ranged from the border to the human in the shadows of our shared but unequal exposure to environmental catastrophe and pandemic. In this volume, cosmopolitics is defined as a problème pratique collectif ouvert. And I want to highlight ouvert, open, in light of what I said before about the dynamic, open, ongoing demand, invitation to keep thinking and rethinking. The title of Etienne's talk this evening is Cosmopolitical Agency, a Necessity and an Aporia. As many of you know, contradiction and aporia have been central to Etienne's work on Europe, on democracy, and many other topics. In this talk, they are juxtaposed to necessity as he engages the problème pratique of political agency on a global scale. The talk will be followed by a discussion that will be led by my esteemed and dear colleague Anupama Rao, who is Professor of History and Middle East, South Asian and African Studies at Barnard College and Columbia University, and who is the Director of the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society. Anupama Rao is a specialist of the history of caste and race and their intersections with gender, as well as a leading scholar of comparative urbanisms. She is the organizer of the Ambedkar Initiative, which draws inspiration from the contributions of Columbia alum B.R. Ambedkar to theorizing and combating racism in and beyond South Asia. Anupama Rao is the author of The Caste Question, Dalits and the Politics of Modern India, the editor of the volume Gender, Caste and the Imagination of Equality, and also the editor of the memoirs of the Dalit communist Sahendra Moore, among many other publications. So I'm looking forward to Anu's comments, but first, please join me in welcoming back to Columbia our colleague Etienne Balibar.
Does it work? Oh, yes. Terrific. Thank you, Madeleine. Thank you so much. Thank you all, everyone, for being here tonight to meet us, listen to my talk. Thank you, Anu, so much, because you are both one of the organizers of this event or ceremony, and because you have kindly agreed to be my respondent. I couldn't wish something more pleasant and rewarding. Yes. So, this lecture, which I have the honor and pleasure to give at the Maison Française, as an opening to the unretirement visit that, with a mixture of melancholy and great emotion, I'm paying to a place where I have spent so many hours and weeks of fruitful and enjoyable conversation with extraordinary students and colleagues. This lecture combines reflections on themes which I had many occasions to address in my classes of the previous years. It also includes what I could call the afterthoughts coming to my mind or emerging from discussions with readers after earlier this spring I had completed the volume of essays that Madeleine has shown to you. It's horribly thick, touching different contemporary issues and bearing the title, as you said in French, Cosmopolitical, which should be translated as Cosmopolitics, a title already used by some people, some of which are here tonight, who paved the way for my own thoughts on this question. And the subtitle, as you also said, Des frontières à l'espèce humaine, let's say more explicitly, from the issue of borders to the idea of the human species or the human race. I will use this possibility that it doesn't exist in French to use the category race both in the singular and in the plural. That would be totally impossible in French. As a single political agent, which of course is a completely enigmatic idea, at least to me, Aporia. In the introductory essay of this collection, I traced back the problem of cosmopolitics to a confrontation. Is it okay? Does it work? Well, a confrontation between the twin legacies of Marx's internationalism and Kant's cosmopolitanism. They belong to an era, of course, with a concept of history that for a number of reasons can no longer be completely our concept of history today. Still, they keep inspiring an amazing number of reflections on the principles and modalities or agencies of a politics that is not enclosed within national borders or limited to interactions between isolated territories, but always already has a global dimension, even and above all when its terms are locally determined. What these two legacies have in common, among other determinations, is a reference to the idea of transforming the world. More precisely, the idea of a practice, a category is interestingly prevalent on both sides, in Kant and in Marx, whose subjects are called to transform the world, although in Kant this practice is primarily moral and juridical, whereas in Marx it is primarily social and political. Any critical discussion of what we owe to Kant or Marx and how we diverge from them must also, therefore, involve a reflection on the concept of the world that we are using. And this is where I would like to begin. I want to insist on the following premises. Despite the strong incitation coming through the categories of globality or totality, which are quite naturally associated with an idea of the world, in particular because it is never, such an idea is never completely separated from a cosmological background, the essential characteristic that I have in mind, and I will return to this again and again in the lecture, is not the unity of the world, but rather its divisions or its immediately dissociated character. More precisely, I would say that we are talking about a world, social, moral, but also natural, or more precisely environmental, that is unique but not unified. In some respects, it evolves towards a greater uniformity, but it is this process of uniformization itself that continuously divides the world against itself and for itself. In a loosely Heideggerian terminology, we could say that what we call the world is a unity that is affected and concerned by its own division and the modalities of this division. It suffers from the division that it nevertheless reproduces within itself. There are different modalities of division, however, which are more or less tolerable and make the world more or less livable, inhabitable in common. A world that can be shared by or among its inhabitants. This, of course, considerably depends on which places, which parts or regions of the world we are considering, at which historical moments, and from whose point of view. I will state the obvious by posing as a postulate that today's world is becoming less and less livable or inhabitable in a great number of places for an always greater number of its inhabitants, whether human or indeed non-human. The world that concerns us, whose main attribute is to be home for humans and more generally living beings, what the ancient Greeks called the oikoumene, is not identically the world for all. Let me quickly mention some symptoms of this situation which can be presented as negations of the commonality of the world. There is the negation of the world as peace or order, which takes the form of a continuous expansion of what I would call the global civil war, never interrupted, but moving from one region to another. Yesterday it was the Middle East, where in fact it is far from finished. Today it is Europe in its central region, with the more global confrontation that it is threatening to unleash. There is the brutal negation of the world as a place of refuge or shelter, a place for lending, healing, and recovering when one is uprooted or threatened somewhere with elimination, which takes the form of a continuous transformation of migrants or errants, as I prefer to say generally, into public enemies. There is the negation of the world as the common home of the human race in the singular, which takes the form of ubiquitous racism with different genealogies and degrees of discriminations among races in the plural. There is the negation of the world as life world, or as French philosopher Bruno Latour prefers to say, the earth, la terre, le terrestre, which is a life world for the human species and many others. In fact, since in fact no species can live independent of all the others, especially not the humans, taking the form of irreversible destruction of the environment and climatic change, destroying the existing natural world, therefore also affecting its counterpart, the cultural world. We might say that all these negations are aspects of a reversed cosmopolitanism. They call for a negation of the negation, to put it in Hegelian Marxian jargon. This doesn't mean that there ever existed something like an originary cosmopolitanism, although we could say that it negatively reveals a cosmopolitan component of every civilization in history. But it does mean, in my opinion, that the cosmopolitical question is again on the agenda, because the negations of the cosmopolitan order are unbearable for many of us or them. I shall discuss these issues in two moments. The first remains cosmological, trying in particular to describe the factor that simultaneously globalizes the world and divides it, namely the institution of the border in the broad sense, national but also economic and supranational, characterized today by its high degree of complexity, overdetermination and conflictuality. The second is properly cosmopolitical inasmuch as it revisits the classical problem of the collective subject of history in terms of the multiple political agencies whose differences and conflicts are involved in the formation and the self-consciousness, or, as Hegel would say, the spirit of the human species. Let me begin with the cosmopolitical. I'll stumble on that at every corner. Let me begin with the cosmological idea. I choose to present it through the following axiom. The world ought to be essentially defined as a meta-border or a hyper-border, encapsulating and over-determining all the borders that separate and unite its parts, a border of borders, as it were. This point of view is, of course, not the only one that we could adopt, that is possible. In particular, if our purpose is to discuss the intrinsic multiplicity of the world, to which I return below. What it focuses on or emphasizes is a relationship of correlation, or as logicians and mathematicians would say, duality, between the territories, the environments, the landscapes, the regions where the humans are settled, but also where they move from or to which they sail, which they try to reach, and the lines and zones of separation, therefore, of course, encounter, exchange, conflict, war, trenches, for example, which articulate these territories and regions in order to shape the world as a world or globalize it, integrating them all, these territories of regions and these borders, into a whole consisting of its own divisions. So if I give a privilege to the borders as institutions, it is not in order to eliminate the question of territories, on which in particular ecology as well as geopolitics tend to concentrate their attention. But it is in order to put the accent on conflicts and metamorphoses taking place at the edges of these territories, rather than on protection and traditions inscribed in their midst or their middle. This is, on my side, a strategic choice. It will lead me dialectically to ask simultaneously the question of the two reverse aspects, globalization and deglobalization. Let me briefly take the example, to illustrate this, of the pandemic in which we have been recently and remain, in fact, trapped or caught. In the pandemic, as it spread, developed, and was treated, there's a clear aspect of globalization, indeed, a new level and a new mode of globalization. A universal process of dissemination and contamination or contagion, following the routes of commerce and migrations, with humans, airplanes, and viruses moving together as fellow travelers, so to speak. This created a more unified and uniform human species, albeit in a pathological and purely passive manner. By transgressing the borders between territories and states, neutralizing them, in a sense, despite every system of containment and isolation. But precisely reversing a tendency towards the generalized circulation of humans as workers, tourists, businessmen or businesswomen, that had become almost a symbol of the globalized world, The partitions and interdictions were strongly reasserted during the pandemic and only partially, or perhaps in fact not at all, compensated for by the huge increase in the uses of electronic means of communication. Remote activity, for example, teaching or loving, etc., which created a double or virtual replica of the human world, sometimes now called the metaverse. Old prophylactic models of the isolation of dangerous populations or populations at risk, notoriously studied by Michel Foucault in Discipline and Punish, which has been quoted again and again during this period, and the institution of external and external passports converged with the intensification of geographic, racial, and social discriminations to deglobalize the global. Probably one of the most violent forms was the discrimination in the distribution of vaccines, which the chair of the World Health Organization, Dr. Tedros Ghebreyesus, did not hesitate, and several times in fact, to call a global apartheid. Very striking expression. From this experience, we may derive some cosmological lessons. This time I said it. The global unity of the world can be treated neither as a transcendental a priori attribute, nor as a simple empirical or historical fact or given. It is always a problematic and conflictual effect of the contradiction between tendencies, practices of globalization and deglobalization that alternate or overlap, as modern philosophers like Hegel, Marx, and Heidegger have continuously emphasized. The concept of world is not separable from a certain representation of history and historicity. But we see that there is no uniform historical tendency, no line of progress there. Rather, there is a dilemma, a change at risk, I would say, which generates unexpected reversals. An objection, however, could be raised here. The uniform tendency does exist now, albeit as a very destructive one. It is the climate change itself. We need to return to that. Climate change affects all humans, but in a highly differentiated proportion. In which sense it is historical remains to be discussed. From there, let's move to the correlative point of view of the borderlines, whose institution but also constant displacements, overlappings, and uncertainties configurate, or as precisely Kant would say, schematize the world, give it a shape, a perceptible shape. To describe the complexity of borders means to highlight the complexity of the world as a system of places, at times conjoined, at times disjoined, between which passages are possible or impossible, allowed or prevented. This, of course, is the cosmological problem, the cosmopolitical problem par excellence. It shows I should abandon that category, but at least in English. Whose origins in modern times could be traced to the philosophical work of Kant on, I'm referring to successive essays in his career, the distinction of the regions of the world, the amphibology of the interior and the exterior, and the question of commerce and hospitality as conditions of universal peace. But let me ask first the more general question. Is the polysemy of the category border, therefore limit, boundary, frontier, difference, the polysemy of this category, is there a meaning, whether geographic or juridical, that we should consider to be the primary, the original one? I think this is, in fact, very dubious. Therefore, we must consider the whole range of applications of the term, also taking into account, perhaps as a guiding thread, the incredible variations of its equivalents in different languages, shift from English to French or to Italian, other languages, of course, perhaps even more, that I unfortunately ignore. And you'll realize how floating this semantic becomes. Political uses and metaphysical constructions of the separation between spaces never cease to interfere. An example is provided by the current representations of the war in Ukraine, a disputed region whose name etymologically precisely means borderland in Slavic, where political, cultural, linguistic, social differences never exactly overlap, offering us a vivid illustration of the general case, whose intrinsic violence is also immediately displays. I'm also thinking of another example, the extraordinary formula that was used some years ago by Hispanic migrants in the US when they marched in huge numbers across the cities of this country, Chicago, Los Angeles, and so on, to demand a recognition of their right of residence and safety. No cruzamos la frontera, nos cruzó la frontera. We did not cross the border. It is the border that crossed us. In fact, several borders crossed them. Without going into every detail, I would like to mention the following dimensions of the problem illustrating the polysemy of the category border. Formally speaking, every border is a modality, first of all, of the projection, I would say, of the divided unity of the world onto a local place of whichever extension. It displays the image of the world in every place, so to speak, by distributing humans coming from different places, citizens of the world, if you like, into fellow citizens and foreigners or strangers between political spaces. Of course, this is brutally emphasized and becomes very paradoxical, even untenable, when the mutually strange people cannot become dispersed into actually different territories, but must live together. In that case, the borderline is reinstalled as a social or a racial line of demarcation, which is called segregation or apartheid. Every place where people of multiple races live together or walk in the same streets is a global border sociologically and most of the time also politically. Conversely, the world becomes constituted as a totality of regions by the intertwining of its own internal borders. For this to be accepted and defended against change and challenges, every borderline must become interiorized in the form of a communitarian unity or psychological unity through various cultural means, such as genealogy, linguistic identity, culture as a common imaginary, etc., which in turn is, of course, again externalized in the form of the distinction between us and them, potentially also friend and enemy. This is so to speak, the most elementary meaning. But there is more, materially speaking. The multiplicity, the hierarchy and superposition of the border lines which form the world as a divided unity of geopolitical spaces. This is, of course, an idea that derives not from Kant or Adam Smith, very similar in this respect, but from the theories of imperialism, dividing the modern world system into center and periphery, including in my late friend Emmanuel Wallerstein's sophisticated elaboration, the highly significant but also very enigmatic category of the semi-periphery. Or it can derive from Carl Schmitt's Nomos of the Earth, the analysis of the historical articulation between the emergence of national borders in early modern Europe, separating nation states, and the great division of the colonial world, which is primarily, in his description, a distinction between two types of wars: legally constituted sovereign nation states, which are also in fact the imperial states, wage, according to him, civilized wars against one another, at least officially, and before the world wars of the 20th century, whereas the colonized other becomes distributed among colonial empires by sovereign decisions, such as the Treaty of Tordesillas dividing the Americas in the early 16th century, or the Berlin Conference dividing Africa in the late 19th century, remains the place where barbaric wars are waged against the humans deemed themselves barbarians, wretched of the earth, in Fanon's terminology. This or any similar idea of the hierarchy of spaces can become extended to articulate several types and levels of regional global borders, which are more or less prevalent in the genesis of conflicts, therefore the constitution of the space for politics in our world today. I would tentatively list the following. 1. The social and territorial borders of segregation, which are active both at the global level, for instance, global apartheid, and at the level of urban districts, ghettos, townships, and suburbs, etc. 2. The state borders, which continuously transform peoples or ethnicities, ethnic groups, into more or less autonomous, more or less enduring nations. 3. The essentially unstable borders between geopolitical blocs, which involve military alliances, empires, hegemonies, rival imperialisms, etc. 4. The borders between zones of unequal development, mostly inherited from colonialism, which separated the global north and the global south, but this is a very complicated pattern, both because there is no such thing as a fixed limit between the north and the south, each of which continuously penetrates the other, and because the climatic catastrophe is now restructuring the division, adding to the economic inequalities a gap between inhabitable and desertic regions. And to all these classical ways of tracing borders across the world, which at the same time make it a single world socially and politically, I would add a more impalpable one, already mentioned a moment ago, to which the recent developments strongly drew our attention and which is probably going to be more and more determining: the border between the historical and social world and the virtual world, which adds a so-called augmented reality. I find this expression incredible. Of course, heavily unequal, but universally applicable to the common world of our interactions and increasingly transforming all our life. The way we work, the way we teach, the way we love or generally affect each other, etc. Which leads me to hypothesizing that the most decisive aspects of globalization and deglobalization are going to proceed from the conflictual encounter not only of geopolitical zones or national sovereigns at war with one another, something which more or less is always presented as the most important aspect of this notion, but from the climatic derangement, to borrow Amitav Ghosh's title, and from the digital colonization, the planet on one side, the multiverse on the other side, two catastrophes, in fact. I will move now quickly to my second point, leaving the first open, since it is only now that I can really address the question that was involved in my title: Necessity and Aporias of the Cosmopolitical Agency. I want to try and articulate the philosophical issue of the universal political subject, which originates precisely in Kant and Hegel, more generally the great Eurocentric narratives of the progress of humankind in the classical philosophies of history, with the less speculative but no less enigmatic issue of the practices which could be said to transform their agents or subjects into citizens of the world. Citizens who are not legally instituted or morally destined, but only given in the process of their emergence, their becoming as an effect of their own practice. It finds a materialist transposition in Marx and Lukács around the idea of a universal class, and keeps obsessing some recent developments on the climate of history, to which I return in a minute. My general thesis will be: cosmopolitical agency is taking place par excellence on the border lines of every sort. I tried to enumerate this polysemy, following them and challenging them, and producing its own heterogeneous hybrid subjects. This is necessary, but it is also largely aporetic or problematic. We may begin with the old philosophical question: is it really possible to consider the human species as a political or cosmopolitical subject? In which sense? Under which conditions? Right from the beginning, this is an antinomic question with no final answer. Just remember that for Kant, the answer to the question was a tentative yes. Such a subject does exist. Humankind is a collective moral subject. Whereas for Hegel, it was a resolute no, because for him, humankind has no capacity to organize itself in the state form, which he sees as the ultimate political institution. Outside the state or beyond the state, no politics, no subject. And we will continue with resuming the answer, but also transposing the question involved in the Marxian notion of the universal class. Are there political actions, militant in the broad sense, which more than others, or specifically, produce cosmopolitical effects, even very locally? Both aspects of the discussion must combine speculative and pragmatic or empirical aspects. In referring a moment ago to the experience of the pandemic that we have been living through recently, I spoke of a passive unity of mankind that proves to be divided and dissociated in the very moment of its stronger and more manifest interdependency. Therefore, of course, also disempowered or unable to govern its own transformation, to regulate the consequences on the very condition of our existence, of our ways of life, our production and consumption. This is, of course, even more the case if we consider the environmental change as such, which everyone's actions influences, even the most elementary or minute actions, such as using this microphone instead of shouting loudly. But that also helps recording, perhaps, I'm not sure. So, everyone's actions influences, albeit with huge inequalities, and which conversely affects everyone's present and future life, albeit again with enormous differences. Hence, the renewed interpellation of the species as a potential political subject, the repeated exigency that the species as such become political or biopolitical, as Foucauldians would say, and not only moral or natural or theological, both directly through the multiplicity of daily individual actions and indirectly or in a mediated manner through the initiatives of governments, states, corporations, etc. They should move from passivity to activity themselves and compel each of us to move in order to transform human species an sich into human species für sich. And of course I deliberately, in itself, for itself, plagiarize here the Marxist formula applied to class instead of species. Such a move is perceived as an increase in the capacity to act of the species, taking place through an institutional substitution of collective interests to particular and corporatist interests, which do not concern only the present, but also and above all the future, because they relate to the consequences to come, whether predictable or unpredictable, of multiple human actions and political decisions, which shows that the concept of the human species as a political subject, although applicable in the immediate situation, involves a temporal, transgenerational, intrinsic dimension. This is very clear, for instance, in the way in which so-called recommendations of United Nations agencies are formulated with the help of alternative scenarios for the future, more or less catastrophic, depending on how fast the humans with their collective institutions will be convinced to act, or better said, to plan their actions. It creates a new and specific constraint on the understanding of agency, and it transforms the Marxian-Lukácsian problematic of the subject-object of history, which was identified to the proletariat as universal class because such a class could consciously reflect on the meaning of its radical disposition in the capitalist society and organize a transition from passivity to activity for the greatest part of mankind, which is also the most exploited part. We see here that we have to do with a speculative problematic, but also with a pragmatic function of orientation for mass collective actions, a mythical function, so to speak, in the sense of Sorel, Benjamin, and Gramsci, which is precisely what gives it a cosmopolitical value. Something is missing, however, in my opinion, in such a transposition of the Marxian-Lukácsian problematic, to which I return, or was inclined to return in particular, because it is largely what one finds in the remarkable recent book by Dipesh Chakrabarty, The Climate of History in a Planetary Age, from 2021. Because in its elaboration of the idea of a transition from passive to active unity or unification, it is mainly focusing on extensive aspects that are taking place throughout the planetary space, neutralizing the borders, as it were, whether national and geopolitical or global. It seems to me that we reach the core issue of the necessity and the aporias if, without neglecting the global as such, we also take into account what I would call an intensive unity, which practically means that not only spatial distances among humans or social groups are at stake, but also differences resulting in discriminations. In other terms, the qualitative borderlines that in every place, as I suggested earlier, separate humankind from itself. I'm particularly thinking of such great anthropological differences that create, as it were, several species within the species, which become hierarchized, included and excluded, whose dignity and worth is recognized or denied. This, of course, is first and above all, but not only, the case of all sorts of races within the human race, constructed and reconstructed as a permanent trace of imperial dominations in terms of heredity, kinship, or genealogy, etc., but also of more recent power structures. With time, I would try and illustrate the current relevance of the issue of discriminations and intensive unification of the collective human subject applicable in every single territory through various examples. But I'm particularly thinking again of the issue of the global vaccine apartheid repeatedly denounced by Dr. Ghebreyesus of the World Health Organization, which in another place I described as a biopolitical recreation of the racial divide of mankind, based on differential vulnerability and differential care. And I would develop the example of the war against migrants, refugees, and errants, which I argued has acquired a genocidal dimension in several parts of the world. In fact, on all the great border lines marking the North-South divide, the Mediterranean, Central America, Southeast Asia. In this second case, the cosmopolitical dimension and the stakes of the transition from passivity to activity is all the more significant if we recall our previous idea that cosmopolitics essentially is a negation of the negation, taking place on the background of a reversed cosmopolitanism, because the war on errants is not, or migrants, is not just a normal operation of the police forces against illegal individuals, and traffics, even a very brutal one. It has become an essential dimension of the idea of the sovereignty of territorial states, which must be enforced continuously through the institution of a state of exception, as Giorgio Agamben would say, in which the bare life of this mobile part of humankind, my own formula, the people of errance or the wandering race, must be ruthlessly eliminated. I will argue that this example, among others, crucially indicates how cosmopolitical agency may emerge, not exclusively, of course, but typically, from the experience of the crossing of borders, the crossing of borders. These agents identify themselves as border smugglers as well as border crossing people, passively and then actively, what Sandro Mezzadra and Brett Nielsen called the use of borders as method. This proposition of mine is indeed much inspired by the pioneering work of Mezzadra and Nielsen, but also Ranabir Samadar, Nicolas de Genova, and others, working on the biopolitics of borders, from which I derive the idea that the question of cosmopolitical agency has a crucial relationship to the treatment of strangers and strangeness or strangerhood, I'm always hesitant, in the most general sense. I also draw inspiration, of course, from post-colonial problematics as the invention of the planetary in Spivak's and Gilroy's sense, and Edward Said's construction of the allegoric figure of exile. What is a stranger? What does it mean to be a stranger? And what constraints and possibilities does this contingent situation open? Is strangerhood a completely dissymmetric relationship ascribed to some people by other people? Or does it involve a reciprocity, at least potentially? These are all the big questions with juridical, sociological, and ethical aspects that lie behind the proposition that cosmopolitical agency and strangeness are closely linked together in today's world. Cosmopolitical agents are generalized or universal strangers who are at home everywhere because they are at home nowhere exclusively. Making a long discussion short, I would suggest that the active principle lies in the capacity of mutual strangers to communicate and mix together, not in order to neutralize strangeness, but just the opposite, to preserve it, protect it from reduction to hostility or enmity, and make it a creative capacity. Hence, in particular, the importance of the practices of translation in the general sense and between different kinds of idioms. This has led me over the years, in conversation with many others, some of which are also here tonight, I'm very grateful for that, to addressing several philosophical and practical issues. First and foremost, the question of hospitality and its intrinsic ambivalence. The discussion must start again with a return to Kant, since in a famous passage from his 1796 essay on perpetual peace, Kant had declared that, I quote, the rights of, I quote the English, one of the English translation, the rights of men as citizens of the world shall be limited to the conditions of universal hospitality, end of quote. This is a very strange statement, which has had an extraordinary sequel in politics and political philosophy, perhaps only matched by some formulas in Machiavelli's The Prince or Marx's Communist Manifesto. It contains an hyperbolic principle declared universally as the rights of men, or human rights, we would say today, themselves, which he further explains, that is Kant, as the interdiction of treating a stranger on a given territory as an enemy, in other terms, as Hannah Arendt famously put it later, depriving him or her of her right to have rights. But at the same time, it includes an intrinsic limitation of this right, which is formulated through the use of the German equivalent of Gast, which in German the same word is Gast. The Gast, in the sense of universal hospitality, is not, according to Kant, entitled to a right of settlement, which he calls Gastrecht. She is only allowed to be a visitor with a Besuchsrecht, to stay temporarily and conditionally. The visitor, in particular, must behave, we would say, be friendly, for Kant to be accepted. For Kant, as for Adam Smith, the prototype of this visitor is a merchant doing any sort of commerce in the broad sense. Of course, at the time, this restriction, which means that the foreigner or stranger does not become a citizen or a full citizen of the land or in the land, was part of a general argument against colonization and a justification of the resistance against colonizers, with examples that Kant draws from China and Japan. But as Arendt explained 1.5 centuries later, in the context of world wars, ethnic cleansing, mass migrations, and the production of stateless people, this leads to a pure and simple denial of the right of hospitality itself. It becomes self-contradicting. Hence the fact that some contemporary theorists, such as Jacques Derrida, proposed an even more hyperbolic formulation, the right not to be excluded or not to become an enemy because you are a stranger should be unconditional. It should not even exclude the potential enemy. A proposition which in turn raises important objections, that hospitality without conditions is by definition utopian or practically impossible to implement, but also that it is a paternalistic principle which confers all activity to the hosts and reduces guests, so-called guests, to passivity, to a condition of victims, begging for charity, as it were. Many recent debates show, however, that you can object to the objection in a dialectics that precisely highlights the political dimensions and potentialities. Politics is never deprived of ambivalence, of course. Unconditional hospitality in Derrida is a strategic formula not independent of context. Don't believe that because he's a metaphysician of the most abstract kind. It acquires its full meaning in an era like ours, where precisely the states and the xenophobic opinion so brutally restricts the conditions under which hospitality can be granted that it becomes in fact annihilated. It is a call to reverse this tendency to negate the negation. And as for the objection of paternalism, it must be taken very seriously, especially in a context of post-colonial North-South divide. But it can be mitigated by noting that the fundamental issue at stake is not just arbitrariness of the governments, it is the kind of use that a population, and especially a population that is instituted as a people or a nation, collectively makes of the land, the territory to which it is historically and juridically attached. Either a restrictive use, analogous to private property, since traditionally ownership becomes defined as a right to exclude others from your property, which in that case is your land or your territory, or an inclusive use involving as its correlative a right not to be excluded, therefore expanding the idea of communality, a communist idea of property, as it were. But in both cases, I would especially insist on the fact that The transition from passivity to activity doesn't simply mean that homogeneous subjects are changing place or changing attitudes. It means that a hybrid subject is formed, a subject that jointly and riskfully confronts the legal and violent obstacles to mobility, cohabitation, and settlement. Such a collective subject is best described, in my opinion, as incarnating a new form of internationalism. Perhaps not so new, in fact, because the problem already has a long history. Its meaning becomes visible on every borderline where migrants, refugees, and activists, or simply humans in the moral sense of the term, join forces and efforts to resist the procedures of elimination and, to borrow our colleague Saskia Sassen's category, expulsion. This should be my last remark, although I took only one example, however significant, among so many possibilities in the current global situation that calls for a political construction of the species as such, through overcoming its internal discriminations. It seems to me that the example suffices to support the idea that internationalism is at stake in every movement or process that operates the transformation from abstract cosmopolitan ideas to concrete cosmopolitical practices. This is once again where the legacy of Marx and the Marxist tradition remains as significant as the legacy of Kant or Hannah Arendt, and in fact must probably transform it or correct it, provided it is itself critically re-examined. Paradoxically, there was something highly reductive in Marx's speculative idea of the proletariat as universal class, which for him was the proper name of the international and internationalist agent. The internationalist agent is not an identical subject, philosophical speculative category that Lukács, for example, continuously uses. It must not only embody a common interest or a common experience, which is susceptible to become expressed in a single discourse or self-consciousness. It must contain an actual multiplicity, an element of permanent strangeness that, in a dialectical unity of opposites, simultaneously works as obstacle and incitement towards the recognition of the human as such. Internationalism and cosmopolitanism are therefore mutual prerequisites in forms always dictated by history. Thank you very much for your attention.